Hey there and welcome to Storybook for React Apps. My name is Yann Braga and I'm the instructor of this course. I'm a software engineer at Chromatic and I'm part of the Storybook team. And I want to show you how Storybook can improve developer and designer collaboration by a lot. I've set up Storybook in countless companies and I saw how the development workflow improved so much after doing that. So much that I actually created this course to share all of that experience with you. We're going to learn what Storybook is and the key concepts around it, like atomic design and component-driven development. Next, we're going to use MuleDrop to showcase the development process of a feature in the app using Storybook. We're going to learn how to break the design down into components and start adding them to Storybook, from the most atomic ones to complex composition of components. In that process, we'll use a variety of Storybook add-ons that help increase productivity, and we'll also integrate Figma designs into Storybook. We're gonna go through different ways of handling and mocking fetch requests in Storybook using tools like Mock Service Worker. And we're gonna even add entire pages to Storybook, allowing us to simulate every use case of a page, like the success, error, loading, and more. On top of that, we'll be using the latest features of Storybook, such as interactions, combining the power of Storybook wrappers for testing library and jest that run in the browser so that we can write stories with automated interactions. We have an entire module about testing, of which we'll learn different testing strategies and automate interaction and accessibility tests using the Storybook Test Runner. And finally, we'll be setting up Chromatic, a cloud-based tool that improves your Storybook experience by bringing you Storybook hosting and visual regression tests in a way that will help you catch regressions, but also improve the collaboration between you and your colleagues while making pull requests. By the end of this course, you're going to know so much about Storybook, you will be able to impress your entire team by implementing a tool which will greatly improve their development workflow. I'm super excited that you're joining me in this journey, and I cannot wait to show you all the wonders of Storybook. Let's get to it. So what is Storybook? I want to answer that with a story. Let's suppose you're developing on a project and your project manager comes to you saying, "Hey, I need you to develop a feature for the checkout page." In order to work on that feature, you might as well have to spin up the backend instances. You might have to run the application. And then once you run the application, you have to authenticate the specific users. And then you need to click here, click there, go through different steps, all the way to finally find that feature component, which is the only thing you actually cared about in the first place. And that process is happening over and over every single time you have to work on that feature again. So what do we learn from that story? We basically have a complex setup that is required to run the application, might take some time to compile a big project. The feature is pretty hard to reach, and there's the possibility of flaky data or incomplete APIs, which might impact your development, and overall the entire external environment affected your development process. So if we're able to get to that story, but be actually just focus on that single component, which was the only thing we cared about in the first place. And not only that, but actually extract these components in isolation, being able to work on them even easier. All of the problems that we just mentioned, they kind of go away. But how do we actually do that? Well, Storybook is the tool that supports that workflow. Storybook is an open source UI workshop that helps you build components in isolation. You can visualize the different visual states of your components, and with the help of add-ons, you can maybe switch props at runtime and see how your component behaves, as well as detect if your components are behaving in certain ways that you're expecting, as well as even switching backgrounds or themes. And additionally, Storybook provides a way to automatically generate documentation pages from your components based on its metadata. It also helps you put documentation and development closely together. So in short, Storybook is a tool that helps you build components in isolation. It lives outside of your application, which is faster and simpler to use. It provides hot reloading dev environment for a great developer experience. You can also mock all use cases you want for any component you have, and it works as a living documentation, which makes it simpler to maintain. If you're using add-ons, you get extra functionality and integrations. Overall, it's a tool with the mindset of developing first and integrating later, which helps you get rid of the external environment and focus on what matters to you. You have an incredible amount of add-ons that provide you all kinds of different functionality, as well as integrations with so many tools that you use and love. So who is Storybook for? A lot of people think that Storybook is a tool only for developers, but that's not true. Well, first of all, for developers, there is the value of being a development tool for both application and component libraries. There's an extra value as a documentation tool for developers. However, it could also be used by designers to serve as a UI catalog so they can check whether the components are already implemented in the application, and that will help them make the designs for the apps. It's also useful for stakeholders because Storybook can be shared across other non-technical folks and they can use it as a showcasing tool. And overall, it's a tool for everyone that helps collaboration improve overall. So how does it actually work? It starts with a simple installation process, which is supporting a lot of different frameworks. You run npxsb init in your root folder and it will install everything necessary for Storybook. And then once that is done, you can run yarn Storybook and that will open Storybook. But Storybook doesn't automatically get everything from your project. So given a situation where you have a restaurant card components, just as simple as that, it receives props and it renders differently based on that. You have to create a new file called restaurantcard.stories.jsx, of which you import that restaurant card component, and then you have the following constructs. There's a default export which contains the metadata of the component, which will be sent to Storybook, as well as named exports of which we call stories, and each of them represent a visual state of the component. So they're essentially a component plus some extra annotations. For instance, the default will render a default state of the component with all of these informations from there. And the loading state will basically render the loading state of the component. So following that logic, you can basically have as many stories as you have use cases for your components. And there's a lot of companies using Storybook, which is pretty cool. And I'm going to show you an example of a real case for Storybook. Here's The Guardian, one of the biggest newspapers in the UK. As you can see, the website is pretty complex and it contains a lot of different components, which can have different variants. However, to develop, they use Storybook, which allows them to see things in isolation in all of their variants, being able to document each of their components, and going even to something more complex like an entire front page. So looking at a workflow without Storybook, you normally have to develop and integrate at the same time. That sometimes requires a lot of effort, and also your pull requests end up becoming quite big. So you make the pull request, you have to publish the entire app to a test environment so you can get the feedback from your colleagues. But if you add Storybook to that workflow, you can actually develop and only later integrate, which allows you to actually focus on small pieces of your feature components, let's say, and then you can make smaller pull requests which are easier to review, and you can publish Storybook containing that component for people to test and give you feedback. So in the next lesson, we're going to go through all of the interesting concepts around Storybook, as well as how things work piece by piece, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I'll see you in the next one. Before diving deep into Storybook, it's important to learn about the key concepts around it. Storybook strongly revolves around a component-driven approach, a development and design practice of building user interfaces with modular components. It works by building a UI from bottom to top, one component at a time, starting from the simplest like a button or an input, then going up and combining these components into features like a form, then going even further to assembling pages and finally integrating those pages into your application. Breaking things down like that brings a lot of benefits, speed, and efficiency to your UI development workflow. A lot of tools follow this concept, including React. In the Thinking in React article from the official documentation, it says that React makes it easier to think in design systems and UI states, and that's because it follows the component-driven development structure. It mentions that you should start with a mockup of the data as well as the designs, and then you can break that UI into a component hierarchy, which essentially yields something like this. As an example, you've got an entire component which is called filterable product table that is a composition of other components, which could also be a composition of even inner components. Once you've done that study, then you will have a component hierarchy. Once you have that, you can start building your application. You start building by the bottom specific components like this product category row, which is over here. And then you go to the product row, and then you go to the product table. You keep going up all the way to finally getting into your application, which receives the mock data and then will yield the final result. There is also the concept of atomic design, a term from a book by Brad Frost that explores component breakdown using scientific terms to categorize them, where you start from the most atomic components and they get composed into molecules, organisms, templates, and then pages. This exercise really helps you simplify the complexity that is building application pages. These concepts are pretty important to keep in your minds because they can serve as a tool to improve the way we think and develop UI. Although you don't need to necessarily follow 100% of them by the book, it's just important to use them as reference. But anyways, now that we're familiar with these terms, we should get going and start with Storybook. Let's get to it. In this course, we will use Storybook in a real-world application. However, to learn the basics of Storybook, let's start with a fresh project using Create React App, and then later on move to the real project. I'm going to open the terminal and type npx create react app. I'm going to pin it to the version 5, and then I'm going to call it learning project with a template of TypeScript. Once this is done, let's open the learning project folder which was just created using our editor. I'm going to be using VS Code. Now that we have our project, I'm going to open the terminal and I'm going to install Storybook to it. Installing Storybook is as simple as running a single command called npx sp-init. This command will automatically detect the configuration of our project. In this case, it's a React project using Create React App, and it will install everything necessary for Storybook to run, including an initial boilerplate that teaches us how to use Storybook in its basic form. Once this is done, it's telling us to run npm run Storybook so we can start Storybook. And this is possible because Storybook made changes to our package.json by adding a couple of scripts. The first script will start Storybook in development mode on port 6000. And the second one will build Storybook as a standalone application in case you ever want to deploy it and host it somewhere for other people to access it. Though you could use npm, I'm going to use yarn. So let's start by typing yarn Storybook to run the application and see what happens. Storybook should open a new tab in our browser with an introduction page containing very interesting and helpful links, as well as an example for a button, an atomic component, a header, which is a composition of components using the button, and a page that composes everything together. Those are there to serve as example for us to create our own stories. But what exactly are stories? If you look at the components, for instance, a button has different props and reacts differently to certain props. So in this case, we have a large button and a small button, or maybe a primary button and a secondary button. So stories are basically a combination of a component and certain annotation that makes the component react differently. So in this case, we're passing different props to the button and it's showing us all of these 4 different states. The stories are defined in code. So if we look at the examples that Storybook set, it added a stories folder to our project. It contains all of the components for the button, the header, and the page, but as well as the components, we can see some implementations here. We also see the button.stories.txx file. And these are the stories files, which we're not getting into detail right now, so don't worry about it. But essentially these files, they are defining the primary, secondary, large, and small. And as you can see, there are different configurations which are passed, so we can see how they visually look. And when writing stories files, we should be mindful of where they should be at. So in this case, Storybook added a stories folder containing both the components and the stories. Some people like to put all of the stories in a separate stories folder. However, I don't think that's really good. The best practice is to actually, let's suppose you have a components folder, and then these button specific implementations, they should be part of the specific button folder, so that if you ever look for the component, you will see all the necessary files collocated right to it. So test files, style files, stories files, and others. But in this case, I'm just going to put it back and put in the same structure it was before. And together with the stories folder, Storybook also added a folder called .storybook. Inside of it, there are 2 files. One is called main.js and the other one is called preview.js. It's important to think that Storybook is a combination of a server and a client. So what we're seeing right now, it's the Storybook client, and what is happening right here is the Storybook server. The main.js file is used to configure the Storybook server, and it tells Storybook how to load and process the story files. It contains the main configuration that Storybook needs to work. So as you can see here, we have the definition of the stories, and we're defining globs for Storybook to find these stories files. There's a list of add-ons, which we'll get into detail in the next lessons, and there are some extra configuration. Because this project uses Create React App, there is a preset which is automatically installed, and this is using Webpack 5. There's also the preview.js file. And the preview.js file is what configures the client part of Storybook, which essentially tells Storybook how to render and how to behave in the client. So as we can see here, there are a couple of parameters that are configuring something related to add-ons, which we'll also get into detail later. But essentially, if you need to configure how Storybook renders something, let's say you need to add some global styles, or you want to add a wrapper around all of your stories, preview.js is the file that will load the configurations for that. So this should help you understand a bit more. Basically, once you have a configuration file, Storybook will read it and process in the Storybook server, which will open the browser with the Storybook client where you actually have the application. So if you ever want to make any changes on how the components render in the Storybook client, you can make changes to the preview.js file. And because Storybook uses hot module reloading, you don't need to run the application again. However, because the main.js file is connected to the Storybook server, in order for your changes to be applied, you have to kill Storybook and run it again. So for experimentation's sake, let's kill Storybook and let's change something in main.js. I'm just going to delete the stories MDX blob so that Storybook doesn't load this documentation story. So let's run Storybook again and see what happens. So Storybook should open again, but without the documentation story. So now you see how important it is to make sure to rerun Storybook after changing the main.js file. Sometimes in the future you might find yourself in a situation where your changes don't get applied, and that might as well be the reason. And that's pretty much it for the lesson. We wanted to explore Storybook for a bit, and in the next lessons we will dive right into the details. I'll see you in the next one. So we've seen our Storybook and its stories. We have a button, a header, and a page. But what exactly makes up a story? Well, it's first of all important to understand that Storybook follows a format called Component Story Format, which is an open standard based on ES6 modules that is portable beyond Storybook. That means that other tools can take advantage of the same format and you have interoperability across technologies. So if we look at this, let's say the button components, we have the button.stories.tsx file over here. And let's make this bigger. The CSF format consists of, first of all, a default export, which we call the meta. And the default export is where you actually define the title of your component, which will be reflected on the sidebar. We pass the component so that Storybook uses it internally to get a lot of information. And then we can pass extra information, which we'll get into detail later. The second aspect of a CSF file is that it has to have named exports. And those named exports are expected to be a story, of which could be composed of a render function and some extra annotations. Remember, a story is nothing more than a combination of a component and some extra annotations. And if you look at this, there's like template.bind, but what exactly does this mean? Well, essentially, you could easily just define a render function directly in your stories like this, but that also means that you're just repeating code over and over. So the idea of the template is to essentially create a master template of which you define this function which will render your component, and then you can reuse it by cloning that function as well as adding some extra annotations. So what exactly are these args things that we see here? So Storybook has a construct called args, which you could think of something similar than, let's say, props, but it's used extensively in many parts of Storybook. So given that our render function receives args and passes them down to the button as props, by setting primary.args and putting these things, the primary story will receive those props and the component will render accordingly. So using that logic, let's create a new story and let's set a background color. Let's say this would be background color and let's set it as a red. We call the story red, let's say. And once we save it, Storybook will add it to the sidebar. And then there you go. We have a component which is rendering by receiving the label button, and then the background color is red. And like I mentioned before, the args are actually used by other tools inside of Storybook. So if we actually open up the panel of add-ons, we could either click here or just press A. We see that there's an add-on called Controls. And add-on Controls detects the args for a given story and provides this panel where you can tweak with them. So over here we see, okay, initial value of background color is red. However, I can actually play around and set it to something else. And that's pretty useful for especially designers to check whether a component is correct. So we could basically play around and the component will re-render with those new props. And as you can see in this panel, we have different kinds of controls per prop. So primary is a Boolean, a size is actually a radio group, and the background color is a color picker. But how does that actually work? Well, that comes with another concept called arg types. So each of these args, they have types such as a string or a Boolean or etc. And the control add-ons uses these types to provide you the correct elements in its panel. These types are called arg types and they are automatically processed by Storybook by using the component which we declared in the meta, which is why we should always declare the component there. And from that, it was able to infer all of these things. However, a background color, given that we're just setting this as a string, it can't really be turned into a color picker unless we set something more complex. So we can do so by defining archetypes. So if you see in the meta, this was already set in the template. So we're defining the archetypes for the component, of which if you have a prop called background color, use a control of type color. And it's interesting that archetypes, by being set on the level of meta, which is basically the component level, they will be applied automatically in each and every story. However, you can also manually set archetypes to a very specific story, such as the red story. So as an exercise, let's set archetypes to make the background color only a select number of colors. So we start by defining the archetypes property under red. As you can see here, we have auto-completion from the types, which is coming from our component story type here. So we set background color to have a control, let's say inline radio, as well as some options, which is an array of, let's say, red, green, as well as blue. So now we see that component is rendering in red, and we only have these three options, so green and blue. And if we check other stories, the background color is still a color picker. So that's pretty much how these things work. You can define args, which will be passed down to your components as props, and you can define the types of them either manually or they will be automatically inferred by Storybook. And another interesting aspect of args is that args are cascading. And that pretty much means that you can define args on the story level, but you can also define args at the component level in meta. So if you define args over here, they will be applied to every single story. And if we analyze our stories, actually, we see that label button is added in pretty much every single story. So why not just remove it? In fact, the secondary story doesn't even need to have args anymore. And then we set the args on the meta level. So let's do args. And once again, we also have auto-completion because of our component meta type over here. Let's set the label to, let's say, hello world. So this will apply hello world to every single component. However, we see that this is not really called hello world, and that means essentially that this button has a persisted state from the args we changed before. We can click on this button that will reset the args to the default ones, and we'll see hello world, as well as in every single story that we have here. And following the same concept, if we were to have a prop or an arg that is actually complex, let's just say it's called user, and then it's got name, let's say Yann, and then an age of 30, we actually can set one specific property, let's say here user, and then name John, and Storybook will actually not override it, but merge it, so that you can define partial data over here and also override partial data over there. And that is very useful for more complex scenarios, which is not the case, of course, in our button. And we were saying about all of these auto-completions, both in the meta and the story, but how does that actually work? Well, first of all, Storybook contains a few types in TypeScript. They're called story, meta, component story, and component meta. Component story and component meta are types specifically to Storybook React, where you can pass as a generic the type of your component, and the props from your component will be automatically inferred by that type. And then you get args and archetypes and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing here is that we're only typing our template for our stories. And this is just being cloned, but at the same time, you see that the primary and secondary stories, they have the correct types. And this is only possible if you have a specific configuration in your tsconfig file, which is either strict mode to be true, or if you don't want strict, but you still want that functionality, there is a strict bind call apply flag that you have to set to true. In this case, because this project already contains this, it's not a problem. But if you see this problem happening at your project, that might be as well the reason. So we went through one of the stories, and we see that this stories is a TypeScript file, the header and the page as well. However, the introduction stories are not. So this is MDX. Well, the first thing is, in the previous lesson, we removed the MDX entries here, so that's why you don't see in the sidebar. Just make sure to add it back, so let's do that right now. And once again, we made changes to main.js, which means that we have to run Storybook again. So in the meantime, let's just check this introduction stories MDX. So Storybook also allows you to write and author stories by using a markdown syntax, which also allows you to add components on that as well. It follows the same concepts. You have meta, you also have stories, so it's pretty similar over here. But the added benefit is that you can actually add arbitrary text to document things. So in this example, we have an introduction story that actually contains just links and other cool stuff. And that's pretty helpful, especially if you want to onboard your colleagues at your company. It's always helpful to have an introduction page in your storybook to help them with that. And one last thing to discuss is the file structure and the naming of your stories. So if we look at the button stories, we have example/button in the title. Storybook uses the title property to define how your component will be shown on the sidebar. So if we actually call this, let's say, component/button, Storybook will change it in a way that will separate from this example category. And now we have a separate category called components and button. And a good practice is to normally follow the structure of your files. So for example, if you have a folder called components and you have a component called badge, you should have components/badge. However, if you go deeper, such as pages, homepage, components, restaurant section, you should also have the same thing on Storybook, and it will actually group these things for you. So if we go back and we, let's say, components and then atomic/button, Storybook will actually group this out over here. And let's just make this a bit more fun. And let's change the header as well to be components/atomic/header. So by having those two things in the same category, Storybook will add them to the same folder. And that's basically how you can organize your components in the sidebar. And by looking at the header component, we actually see something new. We have parameters over here and a layout of full screen. So what does that mean? If you look at the button, it actually has a padding around it. But if you look at the header, it is actually closely together with the frame. The reason for that is that normally headers or pages, we don't want to render them with some spacing. So if we actually remove this layout here, we will see that the header will render with the padding. And Storybook provides you a way to configure that by either passing layout of full screen, padded, or centered. And the layout will be changed accordingly based on this property. And parameters can also be used to configure Storybook add-ons, which are essentially these configurations here we see on the top, as well as the panels, which we'll get into detail in the next lesson. So I'll see you in the next one. Sometimes you might want to add extra markup or functionality to what's rendered in your stories. In example, we have this page stories, which we have a template that basically renders a page component. Let's say we want to wrap the page story into a border container that has a max width of, let's say, 400 pixels. We can do that by changing our master template, which will look something like this. So we add our wrapper, and then we save this, and then every single story that uses the template will be wrapped in this border container. But it's not great to have this implementation inside of our template, so let's undo the changes we made, and let's apply a concept called Decorators, which Storybook provides as a way to have an annotation to your story that will essentially wrap the story with some extra markup. So we can create over here, let's say, we normally call it width, and then whatever the decorator does, let's say max width, and the decorator receives the story event, so story function as a parameter, and then it can return the template. So let's just do return right here, and then we add story event as the element, and then we just close our div. So once we do this, we have to apply this decorator somewhere. And in this case, let's say we want to apply for every single story. We can essentially add to the meta because it's a component annotation, and the decorator's property is an array, so you have to pass like that. Now we see that the style is being applied the same for every story over here. However, you might want to have the decorator applied only to a particular story, so let's comment this out, and only to the logged out story, let's add decorator to that story level. So you can essentially access your logged out story.decorators, which is also an array, where you set the width max width. You see now that the logged in story is correct, and the logged out story has that style applied. But what if you actually don't want this to be in your component level or even your story level, and you actually want to apply this decorator to every single story of your storybook? That's totally possible. So let's first of all remove the implementation here and extract this out. How can we do that? Well, first of all, the preview.js file is where we can set some configurations for the rendering of Storybook, and that will be applied at a global level. So a good practice is to actually have a decorators file over here where we can define all of the decorators which will be used in Storybook, and we can export them. And if you want to have better type safety over here, you can import a type from at storybook/react called the decorator fn. And the decorator fn is set over here. Once we set this decorator, we will look at the preview.js file and we will be importing it from ./decorators, and it's called with max width. And the same way this is exporting a const called parameters, we can actually export a const called decorators. The decorators, once again, is an array, so we set it like this, and then we just put our decorator right here. And as a result, you see that the decorator was applied to this story, but actually to the header, as well as to the button. So given this setup, what you can actually do is create a const over here in your decorators file called, let's say, global decorators, which will contain an array of all of the decorators that we feel like should be applied globally to Storybook. So let's add it like this. And then this global decorators, we will be importing from here. So instead of doing with max width, we call global decorators, and then we will change this to that. And because preview.js applies the project annotations, all of the decorators from global decorators will be applied to every single story. However, we can still import specific decorators that are not part of the global, which will be used in specific stories. And another interesting aspect of decorators is that, according to the documentation, the second argument to a decorator function is the story context. And that story context contains a lot of interesting information about your stories. So let's try this out. Let's say we have now context, and let's just console log this to see how it looks like. We bring up the dev tools so we can look at the logs, and we see that we logged an object. The object is context, and that contains a bunch of stuff. So we actually have access to the arcs being passed to our button story. We have access to the component ID, to the title, as well as the name and the arc types. So there's a lot of things that you can actually do from here and be creative about it. You might be able to extract a few arcs and do some extra functionality. You might be able to add let's say a heading section to every story where you add some stylized banner with the story name or whatever. So it's pretty interesting to think about it. In our case, we don't necessarily need context because our use case is pretty simple. However, this will be useful in the next couple lessons. And another important information about decorators is that they are applied in the order of which they were declared. So let's just suppose I have another decorator which has a div that says hello world and then renders the story. As a result, we see that the hello world is actually outside of these boundaries. So if we were to change the order of these decorators, we would see that the hello world is now inside of this boundary. So basically what this means is that the decorators, they come from innermost to outermost in the order of which they are defined. And this goes for decorators applied in preview and then meta and then story in order of precedence. For now, this component example is really simple. However, if you use decorators to apply theming or access to state management libraries like Redux, the order of which you define them might be pretty important. So it's good to know. And that's it for the lesson. It's just a recap. We have written decorators that can be applied at the component level, at the story level, but also we now have a decorators file which organizes things correctly for us, and we define the global decorators at the project level with the preview.js. For the next lesson, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep these global decorators being used, so let's just remove them from here. Still keep this one in case we want to apply to a specific story. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Storybook add-ons can be installed to provide extra functionality to your storybook. Once they're installed, they can be located in the toolbar at the top or in a dedicated add-on panel. In the official Storybook website, there's a section called Addons. In this section, you can explore all kinds of different add-ons coming from the community or official by Storybook for all different kinds of situations, such as accessibility testing or integration with design tools. By default, Storybook comes with Add-on Essentials, which is a bundle of 8 add-ons that will provide you all the tools necessary to get going. They are registered in the main.js file, as you can see over here, and we see that Addon Essentials is registered in this list. The first one in the list is Addon Actions. Addon Actions helps you visualize when components emit events. If your component has functions like onClick, for instance, like a button, whenever those event handlers are fired, they will be logged in the Actions panel. So if I click on this button, you will see that there's a number which will keep growing as long as I keep on clicking. If we click on Actions, we see a list of onClick events as I click them, which contains the information from my event, which might as well be the return value of your functions. And just like you can set annotations like arcs on a story level, meta, or globally, you can configure add-ons by setting an annotation called parameters. And in this template, Storybook already provided in the preview.js file a global configuration for actions called arctypes_regex, which essentially tells Storybook that any arcs whose name matches these regex, such as onClick, onDrag, onHover, should be automatically turned into an action. Next on the list, we have Viewport, an add-on that allows your stories to be displayed in different layouts and sizes to help you build responsive components. If we look at the toolbar, this is the option for viewports, and it provides you a drop-down for small mobile, large mobile, and tablet. This is more helpful when we look at pages, and you can see how they behave in like small mobile. You can change the orientation and see how it looks on a tablet or whatever else. But you can also define your own options for viewports in case you have specific breakpoints in your app, as well as use a list of devices coming from Storybook. So let's just add a list of devices to improve our functionality over here. We import from Storybook add-on viewport, and it's called initial viewports. And we can set this list by adding a global parameter for the viewport add-on with the key viewport. And then you will define that the viewports list is initial viewports. So now when we select the dropdown again, we should see a list of all kinds of different devices, which might be pretty helpful for us. Next on the list is add-on docs. And add-on docs is used to do a couple of things. First of all, it will provide you support for writing stories in the MDX format, as we saw before, which will allow you to document components with arbitrary text, as well as HTML and React components in that documentation page. Additionally, Docs also provides automatically generated documentation for your components. So for instance, if we have this button over here, if we click on the Docs tab, it will provide us an overview of all of these stories, and it will link us to this specific story. But it will show you an overview of the component with some descriptions, which are inherited from the implementation of the button itself, as we can see here. So primary UI component is coming from the description here, as well as a table of the properties from this component, including the JS doc for each of them. You get an overview of the default value of the component. You can see the code. You can play around with the arcs table here, which actually works similarly to the controls, and the code will change accordingly. So this is great because your components automatically get a living documentation, which means that as you make changes to your components documentation and implementation, Storybook will reflect automatically without you having to do anything. And all of this is only possible because of the construct of args and the metadata that we provide to Storybook. So if we look at the button.storiesTSX, in case we remove the component from here, what actually happens is that Storybook will not have the metadata necessary to extract that information anymore, and as you can see, we have less information. So it's pretty important to always keep defining the component in the meta. The next in the list is called controls, and that we already know, right? In the canvas, if you open the add-ons panel either by clicking here or clicking on A, we see all of the properties that we played around before. And similarly to docs, all of the information over these args come from the component property defined in the meta. And in case you want to have a similar documentation experience, you can actually define, maybe in a global level, a new configuration to add-on controls. By default, there is already a configuration called control matchers, which defines for Storybook controls to automatically turn args into the type of color picker and date in case the prop names they match these regex. And in fact, if we go back to button.stories, because the background color prop fits the regex that we defined in the preview.js, we can actually just entirely remove this and it will work the same. And you can pass additional args to stories even if they're not props of that component. Sometimes you might want args to be handled inside of the template function before passing to the component. Because I want to show the controls matcher for the dates, let's say I add a property called birth date, which is a new date. because we are deciding that the date components following this regex should be a date picker, the controls will become a date picker. And there's an option to extract the documentation from JSDoc and provide them in the controls panel as well. We can provide a new flag called expanded and set it to true. And as you can see here, we get more information about the component, which could be pretty helpful for people using this component for the first time. The next in the list is add-on backgrounds. Add-on backgrounds provides you a way to define different backgrounds for your component so that you can see how it looks like, for instance, in a light background or a dark background. And these options come out of the box as an example, but of course you can configure and put your own over here. It also comes with a grid visualizer that allows you to quickly see whether the parts of your components are aligned properly together. We can configure stories to already select a background by default. For instance, if we go to the button.stories and let's just say the primary story has a parameter, which we can set on the story level of backgrounds. And we say that the default value is dark. Because the add-ons persist the values you select as global query params in the URL, let's say you select light, or you select the background dark, or even if you clear the background as transparent. In case you're making these changes and they're not getting affected, it's because you have to remove them from the URL. So in this case, we see that the story is rendering with the background of dark by default, and if you switch to a different story, it's just using the normal background. Next in the list, we have toolbars. Toolbars is an add-on that controls global rendering options for your stories. It's a general purpose add-on that can be used to achieve things such as creating a theme switcher or a language switcher for your stories. And we will have an entire lesson in this course that goes over that, so let's skip this one for now. And then we have a combination of measure and outline. Both are visual tools that help you visualize alignments, spacings, and dimensions of your components. So let's see how they look like. They're more interesting as you get into complex components such as this page. So let's see. We have this ruler icon for the add-on measure, which essentially enters the measure mode, of which you can visualize the widths, the dimensions, the spacings and margins of the components that you highlight. You can also press M to toggle the mode. And the other one is outline. So essentially it will outline every single element in your page, and it will show you whether the elements are properly aligned or not. And those things are pretty neat for designers to check out. And these were all of the add-ons that compose the Essentials package from Storybook. There's one extra thing that comes in the template that we see. It's called add-on interactions, and it's used in this page component because it's a stateful component that needs interactions in order to change its visual state. If you open the add-ons panel, you will see that there's a list of interactions which were defined in this play function for the logged in story. But we have an entire lesson that goes through this into detail, so we'll skip it for now. I'll see you in the next one. In a previous lesson, we learned about main and preview files, the most important configuration files of Storybook. We saw how the main file relates to the Storybook server configurations, and the preview relates to how stories are rendered. There is also another configuration file that is not very well known, but can bring very interesting value to your Storybook's UI. It's called the manager. So let's understand a bit more about Storybook and see what manager actually means. So Storybook is essentially just a React application. The pink region over here is what we call the manager, and that communicates with an internal layer called the preview iframe, which renders your stories in isolation. And Storybook has a few options to allow us to customize the manager. In the official documentation of Storybook, it says that to control the layout of Storybook's UI, you can use addons.sectconfig in your storybook/manager.js file. A manager file is something new that we don't have yet, so we might need to create it. And in this file, you can actually set a lot of interesting things, such as you might not want to show the add-ons panel, you maybe want to change its position, enable or disable shortcuts, and a bunch of other stuff. The most interesting aspect of this for this lesson is the theming. So if you see at the bottom, it provides you an overview of the theme, saying that you can change the look and feel of Storybook, but you have to go to the next section. So we click over here. And it tells us that we can change the theming of Storybook by using the manager.js file and configure it to use the dark mode instead. So let's go ahead and create the manager file, but in TypeScript instead. And let's just copy this over here so we can set the dark theme directly by passing the themes from Storybook theming. And because we're introducing the manager file for the first time, we have to kill Storybook and run it again. Now we see Storybook in a completely different UI. The dark mode looks pretty cool. Maybe not for some of the buttons because they have a transparent background, but still it looks really incredible, and it's pretty cool for us to see how we can change the Storybook's UI. But what if we want to further configure our Storybook so that it actually matches our brand? Well, looking at the theming section, if you scroll down a bit more, you will see that there's a bunch of other information. And in fact, at the bottom, you see you can even further improve the styling by changing all kinds of different properties. So as an exercise, I'm going to change the configuration in Manager TS to actually match the brand from newline. And because it's a bit of a code, so I'm just going to paste it out right here and explain from there. So over here, we are calling a create function from Storybook theming. So instead of importing the theme presets, we import the create function. And we set that the base of our theme is going to be light. You could change this to dark if you wanted, for instance. And then we have access to the secondary color, to the background of the app, to the border radius, to the font styles, and all kinds of things. And most importantly, at the bottom, we can change the title of our Storybook. We can change the URL, of which when you click on the logo, it will be pointed to that URL. And you can also change the logo image. And by passing the theme, we have pretty much everything we need. So now we have to go back to Storybook and refresh to see the new UI. And there you go. Our Storybook's looking pretty good and matching with the brand of newline. We have different colors, we have a new logo. If we click on the logo, we will be redirected to the website. And now it might feel much more familiar when using Storybook. So this is pretty interesting if you're working at a company and you want the developers and designers and everybody else to feel more comfortable using your Storybooks. And finally, we can add a fav icon to our Storybook. And to do so, we need a way to add a link tag to the head element of the Storybook app. And you can do so by creating a file called Manager Head HTML in the Storybook configuration folder. And the HTML you add into that file will be injected to the head tag of the Storybook app. The same concept applies for preview. In case you have a preview head HTML file, it will also be injected together with the component. And in order to add a fav icon, all we have to do is to add a link tag with the relationship of type icon with the icon of your choosing. And one last time, we need to kill Storybook and run it again. And finally, we have the fav icon over here as well. Maybe this is interesting because then you can easily find this under your tabs, or maybe not. Maybe you want to keep the Storybook one because it's easier to find. But anyway, this is the way to configure Storybook's UI to make it look a bit more familiar to your peers. And if you're customizing your own Storybook, make sure to share it in the Discord community so that everybody can see how cool it looks like. I'll see you in the next one.